really pleased about this particular panel discussion. It's something that Alpha, who's the company I work for, is very early in their journey around data. So I'm really keen to learn some things from those that are already doing it. So the Dial Global Diversity Review research shows a steep increase in workforce data collection in the UK, but less so in the US. As many companies get on board with self-ID, we are asking how big a role data plays in achieving equity and how companies in the US and the UK can learn from each other. So I'm Vicky, I'm the Chief People Officer at Alpha, and I'm joined today by Alison, Ellie and Layla to talk about self-ID and the rise in data collection. So welcome to you all. I'm going to start by asking you just to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about why you're here on this panel today.
I'm not quite sure why I need two microphones, but all good. So I'm Ellie Tomlins. I'm delighted to be here. I'm the Chief People Officer at Britvic PLC. I've been in and around talent and diversity roles for a number of years now, and data is always one of those bugbear questions that can be the thorn in the side, but equally a hugely galvanising area, and it's a very hot trend right now for many reasons. So thrilled to be part of this panel, and it's a topic that's very dear to my heart, because without data you have absolutely no idea what you're doing.
Good afternoon, I'm Alison Williamson, and I am actually at Yahoo for just over a year. But one of the things that's been consistent, I've been doing this work for a long time, probably closer to 20 years, and the thing that is very important to me is that whatever the work is, whatever we're doing, that it has a purpose. To what end? And so starting with data, you actually can see where you're moving the needle. You have something, it's not the whole story necessarily, but it certainly gives you some benchmarks. And without that, you actually sort of are, maybe doing some really fun things, but not necessarily ensuring that we're having that employees, consumers, are having the experience that you want them to. And I think you know why you're here.
Absolutely. I'll just say on the microphones, we have a very rigorous team led by Jodie, and because we are streaming off LinkedIn live tomorrow, it won't be live, obviously. You hear it here first. We have double mics, so that's why. But I think huge thanks for our three participating sponsors actually, and knowing the work that you're doing both from a product perspective, but also then from the media perspective and the tech perspective actually is fascinating. And obviously, without data, things do not get done. And so I've got some great stats here, but really I am just we'll talk about a few stats in your shadows, both of you.
Thank you all. So Alison, I'm going to come to you first. Josh mentioned earlier that Yahoo have recently launched their self-ID campaign. So can I ask you to just talk to us a bit about how that came about and any lessons and challenges you can share about setting up an initiative like that?
Sure. Well, first I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Emily Heath, who is here somewhere. There she is. When I joined Yahoo, this effort was already underfoot. It is I had just actually completed in my former company, self-ID in the UK and rolling it out, piloting it in the UK and rolling it out in the US. And so I was very happy to hear that Yahoo was already on the move to get that going. I think one of the things that, when we're talking about lessons learned, and the effort is to ensure that we are really communicating why we're doing this, what the intent is. Again, like everything, what the purpose is, to what end. Part of it is because we want people to participate, but it helps us remind ourselves how we should be going about doing it. And that was something that took, it's not a turnkey thing. One of the things that we were really focused on was, well, we're doing this because we want to make sure that every employee knows that we want them to be able to show up fully and that they should be able to reflect all of their identities that they would like to in their Workday profile. What it also meant, though, is we needed to look at those categories and ensure that these categories were inclusive. In the effort of being inclusive, we didn't want to perpetuate othering. And so that really was, that piece of work especially was extremely important because language matters. So a big lesson that I would say that we certainly took away was that there's a lot of opportunity to disrupt categorization, understanding why the categories are the way they are, and then also what we might need to dismantle a little bit so that people can truly show up fully.
And just out of the data that you did get, so what did that inform in terms of changes that you were making or that you're going to make, perhaps? I don't know how recent.
It's very recent.
Right.
We had, so we launched in the UK and Ireland at the end of 2022 and expanded our categories in the US in early 23. But one of the things, also the thing that we needed to also be clear about, not only is the purpose, but also who had access. Because we were asking people about sexual orientation and to the fact that, like, again, all voluntary, but we wanted to make sure that people felt that their information was safe and that it was going to be seen and used in the way that they expected. So the changes, I wouldn't say that we have them yet, but what we have heard is that there has been such an appreciation to being able to do that. One of the key things that we did that was more challenging on the tech end, on the operations end, was we now, instead of having multiple races or multiple identities, it was indicate all that apply. And in fact, I got a call from someone or an email from someone saying, previously when we were in the US, when we did this, I was able to indicate that I was biracial. And I said, well, actually, what you get to do is indicate all of those identities. And the response was, it never even occurred to me that would be an option. And so that mindset, like the response has been really quite positive. And we've gotten more people selecting identity as opposed to opting out. So that too has been really powerful. And I will say that Josh standing over here, Adele Murphy in Dublin, like they were helping drive this. We engaged everyone to ensure that people knew that everyone had an identity, right? And so being part of this did not mean it was only for one particular group. And that was actually a really powerful thing. And I truly believe that helped engage the majority of the company.
Thank you. So I guess then moving on, we've talked a little bit earlier or intimated around the kind of increase in data gathering in organisations. So I'm just, maybe Ellie, I can come to you. Is this something that is happening within your organisation, and where is that drive coming from?
Sure. I mean, very hot topic, sort of the drive for data gathering. And before I start, I probably just should give some credit to the Yahoo story for being a phenomenal piece of best practice. I think so many organisations, when they start the data collection exercise, get really tied up with things like the census categorisation in each nationality and the way things are done in each geography, and they can tie themselves up in complexity. I've certainly seen that in multiple organisations. So great to hear the story and how you've created the ability for people to feel like a truly multifaceted individual in how you collect that data. I mean, yes, we are driving that within Britvic, and I would also say we're still relatively early in that journey. And I've worked for many organisations over the years in HR roles. I've worked for much bigger organisations than Britvic, which is a FTSE 250 drinks company with about 4,000 people around the world. We have some wonderful brands, and we are, a wonderfully sized organisation. And I've worked for much bigger companies, where the HR function is bigger. And I would say the maturity around data collection will vary a little bit depending on the size and complexity of your systems infrastructure, the size and complexity of your analytics capability, well beyond HR. Actually, I think people analytics tends to be a deep function in very large companies, and I genuinely wish I had a huge one. I don't. I have a couple of people. Wayne is smiling at me in the audience because we have a range of capability, I would say, around this complete topic. But I think overall the trend to gather more data is becoming very clear. The fuel of everything. I spent the last 2 days in commercial reviews for our brand plans, and we were talking about data and analytics all the time. And I think that's coming into the HR function, and the HR function is beginning to differentiate, and the DE&I function is beginning to differentiate between data gathering, reporting, through to insight and analytics, through ultimately to sort of automation. And I think where you are in that maturity curve tends to differ depending on the amount of investment you have and the level of coherence and partnership you have with your digital function and your IT function. So we are absolutely trying to drive it as a function, but we don't necessarily have systems that go global, and therefore sometimes we have to rely on what we can gather through different mechanisms. And happy to talk about some of the things we've tried. And you have to rely on often a multifaceted approach, because otherwise you are really wrestling with incomplete data or data that you're not sure you can trust. And certainly in previous organisations have had some really bad, inherited some pockets of data that were unfilled or had been collected very badly. And that requires quite a clean-up exercise depending on where your starting point is.
It's very easy sometimes, I think, to get the data and just look at that, but actually it's the proper analytics around it and the correlation with other sets of data that drives meaningful action.
I think one of the things for me is you start collecting the data, and actually it's very intellectually interesting to begin with, and you sort of go, oh, look, this is interesting. And then everyone looks at you and the accountability's gone up, because suddenly they know that you know things, and what are you going to do about it? And it's a wonderful driver for action. So, you collect ethnicity pay data, you report on your ethnicity pay gap. Okay, now you have to fix it. And that is it's a wonderful trend. It really holds people to account. But, be careful. Collect things that you have capacity to do something about. Don't just collect data for the sake of data.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And once you've asked people for their information, they want to know what you're going to do with it, and they want to see action off the back of it. Yeah, we've had exactly that recently with things like gender pay gap. It's not just about reporting the numbers. It's about, right, what's the action that's going to come out of this? And as Layla mentioned earlier, my organisation is a tech organisation, so they're all over the data and wanting to know more about it. It's not just, well, just trust us that this is the number that's coming out. Layla, you mentioned up front that you've got lots of stats around data and insight and what's coming out of the review. So
absolutely. So I'll chip in with a couple of them here. I'm going to start positively, because actually some great progress has happened. Of course, we've got to keep momentum on with that. On your seats, you all have a little dial tote bag. Within it, there is the Dial Diversity Review. We are having multiple others printed, so do not worry. But we've ranked each of the 10 facets in terms of where they sat in terms of priority. And this is across 200 organizations, 200 large organizations with over 1,000 employees, UK and US. So these are typically LSEG, New York Stock Exchange type organizations. Gender came up number one, which is fascinating. 34% up from 23% last year, because we're now comparing each year. Again, something that actually came up this morning at KPMG Roundtable is the need to track year on year, because otherwise progress slows and you don't keep the momentum up. So we've actually got comparable stats, thanks to Clarissa. 1 in 3, which is 34% up from 23% of participating UK companies, because we also compare the UK and the US, say they have at least 50% female representation on their SLT, their senior leadership team. Companies continue to focus on this, with 4 in 5 saying they specify gender leadership succession planning. So 82%, almost 9 in 10 track progress. What I would caveat this with is some interesting additional findings that we did came out, that actually women are perhaps over mentored and under sponsored. So whilst there is some great moves on gender, is not just about informal mentoring. This is about sponsoring. This is about speaking about people when they're not in the room. This is about how we push people forward for promotions. Very quickly, because I don't want to take the spotlight off our three incredible speakers, but 3 in 5, which is 58%, up from 35% of participating UK companies, have LGBTQ plus representation on their leadership team, and the same number have an approved LGBTQ plus strategy in the last 12 months. Remember, we're looking at CEO -2 here, so that is the 2 direct reports into the CEO, and typically we've seen this drop the higher up you get. And so it's really about the influence that these executives have. We are not saying that non-executives are not important. What we're saying is the executive team who are there pretty much full time have got a great deal of influence. And that's really what a lot of our employees across the board then see. And so having that influence is key. I'll give one more here, and then you can look through the reviews and find out the rest. But ethnicity, 5 in 6, that's 81%, which is up from 58% of UK companies say they have at least one member from a Black or Southeast Asian or other minority ethnic individual on their leadership team. Similar numbers say that they include ethnic diversity in their succession planning, which is great. Again, I would say sponsor, not mentor. We've got to put our money where our mouths are when it comes to ethnicity. And obviously, sadly, ethnicity pay gap, is not necessarily legalized anymore. But what we can do is we can really push that number, because whilst that's gone up, having one is still not enough. It's still not enough.
And I guess just a question for you then to follow up on that. The gender piece has increased quite a lot since last year. Do you think the reporting of gender pay gap externally is driving a bit more of a focus in that area, and therefore should we be looking at other reporting?
I'm a real fan, like all of you, on what gets measured gets done, but not reporting for reporting's sake. So I'd say yes, absolutely, because the second you make something a legally mandated piece, then something will happen. Is just making sure that the culture then within the organization and the trust within your organization knows that that's not just happening because it's a legal issue, therefore, oh goodness, the company have got to do something about it. But of course, it will move things in the right direction. And I think those of us who are sitting here who, have been working at this for many, 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 many years, indeed, are frustrated at progress. So yes, I do believe I'm very far on one side, but I do believe we should be measuring and managing and tracking everything.
So that's a nice segue into. If I can ask Alison and Ellie, are there examples that you can share with us around how this additional data that you're collecting is enabling initiatives and some of the things that you are doing to drive a more inclusive and equitable culture?
Well, the accountability can't be, overstated. It is such a once you provide that information, but also let's be honest, one can strangle the data until it confesses, right? So there are always, you can give numbers, and until you have this consistent reporting and that you have a consistent conversation, it can be dismissed as outlier. Right? Oh, I know why she left. Oh, I know why that person's not here. I know why that person didn't get promoted. Okay. But one of the things that has been very helpful, and this is through self-ID, but also just through primarily through our self-ID in Workday, is understanding progression, right? And so when it comes to how people are thinking about their organization, what are some of the opportunities when they're thinking about succession planning? Half of the things that I have ever been called in to do as a leader in diversity often boil down to communication and leadership, right? Everyone wants to know what their opportunity is in growth in their office, right? When you start to when you do have data, you have data for everyone, and you also can see where the blind spots are, no matter what those blind spots might be. And I think one of the things that we focus on, we did set at Yahoo aspirational goals for both race and gender, and primarily in the US for race and gender globally. We focused on what was just wildly underrepresented by the US Census on race and ethnicity. So that was Black and Latinx. Now, that didn't mean that the work of every leader in the company was solely focused on that, because depending on where they sat, they had other things that they could other opportunities to strengthen the representation. For example, we didn't set goals around the Asian community because we were overrepresented based on our U.S. Census. However, we needed to look at our retention rate there, and so again, it was what we were able to do is cut and do so, like reflect some intersection for each department and each department head, so that they could set their own goals, so that they could understand, like when they're thinking about their future state, what does it look like? So when they're having to make changes, when they're thinking about who's coming in, who they're hiring, who's leaving, having a fuller picture, this data is the foundation of it. And so every quarter, there's a partnership with our HR business partner and diversity, a diversity representative, who will sit and help map through that. Because now the leaders are feeling accountable, but we want to make sure that they also have the tools and the ability to achieve that, so that it isn't just checking the box, that it's actually a well thought out plan for growth and development and evolution of their work.
And I think, you've mentioned Workday a couple of times, have you? How's that supporting?
I feel like in my mind, Workday is sort of like smoking right now, because we've been just like pushing it to the end. It's actually, Workday right now is being like maxed to, like we're using it to its best capacity. And one of the things, it has incredible functionality, and I'm not getting anything for, like, I'm not plugging them shamelessly. It's the tool that we have. And so it's what we use in order to understand job progression, and certainly who's sitting where, and to look for whether or not there are any anomalies or hotspots.
Yeah, cool.
So firstly, I love those stories. I think building this data into your regular talent planning and leadership conversations is exactly where we all need to be, because it's not enough for us to have global goals and global plans. It's got to be made local, and it's got to be made relevant to whatever that team or that leader or that department need to do. And it won't, to Leila's point about diversity being unique, we are each unique, but equally what I need to do in my function, which has quite high female representation, given I'm an HR leader, is completely different than what the commercial teams need to do, is completely different to what my ops teams in manufacturing need to do. And being able to give the leaders the precise tools to be able to gear that and be able to come up with a plan that's meaningful locally is absolutely at the core of our DE&I strategy. I guess I've had Workday in some organisations. Not everyone can afford Workday, I will say. It is a wonderful tool. It's an expensive tool. Someone's going to shoot me for saying that, but it's true. That doesn't mean you can't do things with other mechanisms. And sometimes in the FTSE 250, which I love as a space that gives you all sorts of agency, you have to be a little bit more creative in what you do. We've just implemented in Britvic and equally in Tate & Lyle, my previous organisation, we've used our employee survey to gather much more self-ID information, completely anonymised, but it allows us to ask people to give us sensitive information about themselves, that allow us to then look at what is the engagement and what is the day-to-day experience, manager experience of each of our minority groups, as opposed to our majority talent, and be able to be more precise about where we spend our energy, where we spend our money, where we spend our time and attention has been an incredibly helpful point of precision, because there are so many facets that not every organisation can do everything at once. You have to figure out where to start, and working out where to invest is actually a really healthy conversation for an organisation to have. You know, we've literally just done this, we've got the data back, and actually it's proven to us that those who consider themselves to have a disability are actually a little bit less engaged, and that it's the one, in other facets actually, people are even more engaged, which is great news. But that's given us some real cause for thought, and how we think about how we partner with partners like we have the British Disability Forum, but equally internally our Neurodiversity Network and our BC Network. It's a really important area to be able to work out where we bolster, where we provide support, and where we build challenge for managers to give people confidence in having conversations where they're struggling. So being able to find data that allows you to make meaningful action is the goal. Otherwise, you are really, you could spend an awful lot of time, money, energy, and attention on gathering data and not really being able to do anything with it. If you're lucky enough to have a global tool that applies to absolutely everyone and allows you to do everything within one format, that is amazing. It's not necessarily available to every organisation. That doesn't mean the data journey is not for you.
I really like the idea of adding it in with your engagement survey. That's really nice, because as a starting point to be able to capture anonymised data, it's a safe place to start, isn't it? So that's really nice.
It's worked well in both organisations I've done it in. I mean, you do get tied up in how you define the categorisation, and do you go with the census categorisation, and what does that mean? And you always have people ringing you during the survey and say, well, I'm, a Latinx person, but I'm living in the UK. I'm a UK employee, but in the UK census there is no categorisation for this. So where do I fit? Which come back to your example, Alison, about being able to pick multiple boxes is incredibly important. I think the other thing I would say to watch out for is the relationship between initiatives that work on an intersectional basis and data that drives precision on a small group. Because actually quite a lot of the time, depending on the size of your organisation, your norm group is quite small and it changes year on year, right? So you have to make sure you don't panic and think about, I always think the Holy Grail are the initiatives that will drive impact in multiple categories at once, and it will give you that intersectional lens on some of the topics that you're dealing with. Because inevitably when you start down a data journey, you end up collecting data at a level of granularity that changes significantly year on year, and sometimes could create multiplicity of initiatives that actually the organisation or the leadership group or the employee group can't actually deal with.
Or you're doing so many initiatives that you don't make progress on any of them.
So there's a wood for the trees thing that comes with this journey for sure.
So if anyone's starting out on this journey, I mean, as I said earlier, we're very early. We've just done our first DE&I survey. We've done an anonymised survey to get us started. But if people here are kind of out on this journey to start with, what advice would you give them in terms of how to start, where to start?
Do you want me to keep it?
Oh, you have the mic.
I have the mic. I mean, over the years, I've worked for many organisations, and occasionally you do come in and find, as I said earlier, that one organisation, shall remain nameless, we came in and we said, oh, we should start reporting on our ethnicity data. To be told that actually, at a period in time long gone, they've been collecting ethnicity data into the system, but where it hadn't been filled in, they defaulted to white. So you end up with bad data. So the first thing I know, you feel the ripple go through the room. It was bad. This is years ago. But the thing now is starting by, I think, as Alison was saying, communicating to people what you are doing and why is really, really important. So in that example, we had to go and say, we want to make sure that the data we hold about you is accurate. Can you please have a look? And being persistent, keeping going, and asking again, and asking again, and asking again when you need to, so that you get to a point where you're critical mass in the systems that you hold, that you can have confidence in the data. Because sometimes you often find that your percentage rate filled out is quite low, and actually what that's telling you is the trust in the system, or either the awareness or the trust in the system is low. People don't want you to know, or they're not sure what you're going to do with it. So that brings you straight back to communicating to people why it is important that you hold the data, how you're going to deal with it, and making sure you deal with that within the legislation that's held, because it obviously gets you into lots of sensitive privacy, GDPR-related conversations as well.
Absolutely, and the only other things that I would add are just engaging stakeholders that represent some of the communities that you are from which you're trying to collect information. So where there's like best-in-class information, whether it's Stonewall UK or HRC and Human Rights Campaign and for the sexual orientation, or making sure that our language is up to date, because we do not want to get it wrong when we're trying to get it right. Similarly, just also looking at internal stakeholders, understanding like how does this land? So pressure testing and testing some of the ways that we're framing a question, whether it's a question about transgender identity, like what are some of the ways that we can be smarter and more inclusive in the way that we're trying to gather this information. So everything that Ellie just said, and ensuring that we're partnering with experts who know how to make sure that we're continuing to use inclusive language, and also, again, not other, in an attempt to engage.
I think everything that you said was articulated, and I fully agree with it all. Alice and I were together actually at a roundtable this morning, and one of the things that came up was this local and global nuance, or glocal as we sometimes call it, because there's different legalities in different states, in different countries. We can remain on brand with the ethos of the company, but actually making sure that we check those nuances, that we look at what success looks like within those specific markets is absolutely critical, because otherwise we're not measuring ultimately from the same place. And it's easy to forget in the Western world that actually there's many countries that still have illegalities against a number of these different areas. And so actually looking at where they are right now versus where they want to be, and the local, the cultural and the global nuances.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much. We'll give a round of applause for our panellists. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Jenny Baskerville, Head of Inclusion, Diversity and Equity for KPMG in the UK.
Thank you, Jenny.
Williana Forson, Head of DEI for Royal Mail.
I've got my own mind. I'm the other person. I'm the Chief People Officer for Havas in the UK.
Yeah, happy to share. I think in the kind of access space, there's been some really good work. I'm sure we'll come on to progression because I think that's probably less developed. But certainly, so from KPMG's perspective, we've specifically partnered with certain organisations, brokers, if you want to call them that, that are in the community space and really understand where, I guess, young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, what they're looking for, how you best kind of target them through kind of school and into university kind of outreach activity. And we've partnered with them to, I guess, attract into sort of dedicated programs, but also to think about, I guess, whether our attraction strategy is working. So, to kind of have those listening groups as well. And then we've been very intentional with our sort of selection process as well. So measured, and I know data's come up a lot today, but measuring where people from different demographics might fall down in our selection process, and then work with our providers to kind of tweak the system. So from a systemic point of view, making sure we're kind of de-biasing it, if I can call it that. And positively, we've started to see real improvement in terms of socioeconomic diversity, but all forms of diversity in terms of who's coming through on our apprenticeship and our graduate pipeline. So I think it's kind of partnering with experts in the field, and then being really clear on kind of your selection processes and understanding how you can enhance them to ensure that diversity is coming through.
Yeah, I think yes to all of that. I'd probably just build slightly in that, like for us, partnerships have allowed us, I think, as Jenny said, like to tap into communities or go to where candidates are. Like I think one of our main sort of flagship programs is an internship called Platform, where we bring in 10 interns every quarter and in various places through the business, or rotate them through so they get a real experience. But those kinds of, we deliberately look for candidates that don't have higher education, who don't have experience, and are looking to get access into our industry. Like we are an advertising and marketing agency, or group of agencies essentially, which is an industry that's traditionally been very white and very middle class. So, using partnerships allows us to access talent where they are. The people we recruit for that program are not looking at LinkedIn or opening page 12 of The Guardian or whatever page of The Guardian is. And I think, and as you were touching on, Hannah, for us, I think the other benefit is, in our industry, an initial focus across our DEI push has been around gender and ethnicity primarily, where there's probably the more obvious problem that our industry has had, should we say. But working with partners allows us to educate our people and our leaders and just get a lot more awareness about the other facets of diversity, particularly socioeconomic, because you don't see that, right? So, and I've had so many conversations and challenges actually in some cases where some of the cohorts of our program haven't been ethnically diverse enough in terms of, from the perspective of our leaders, and this has allowed us to kind of have these conversations to broaden understanding as well.
I'm happy to add a couple of bits. So for Royal Mail, I think we have a unique opportunity in that we reach every single household in the UK, right? So our geographical reach and scale as an organisation has really meant that we've been able to be creative without necessarily always focusing on social mobility in itself as a topic, but think about opportunities that we can leverage that naturally help with supporting in that space. A large proportion of our colleagues would probably deem themselves, part of the traditional working class population, right? So a lot of the work that we've focused on doing, and I'll probably talk to the attraction space, but also to how we support colleagues through kind of their own challenges and opportunities that they're navigating every day from an attraction lens. And one of the things I was going to talk about later is I know 30% of organisations, based on the report, have said that they look at social mobility more formally as part of their strategy. Whereas we set out earlier on in the year to look at neurodiversity in our applicant pipeline and started giving questions to interview questions out to candidates before they meet us. And what that's done is actually shown us a spike in attraction from a gender lens, from an ethnicity lens, and certainly from a socioeconomic lens. We talk about things like accent bias and, nervousness around going to interviews when you're nervous about who you're meeting, how they'll perceive you. And actually, that's naturally given us a lot more opportunity to attract in that area. So, thinking intersectionally about socioeconomic inclusion, I think, is very important. And we mentioned partnerships. We work hand in hand with a charitable organisation called the Postal Family Fund that provides opportunities for some of our colleagues who's, for the next generation. So it's things like young people starting apprenticeships, grants to help kind of start their journey, going to university, doing the Duke of Edinburgh. So really thinking about how we supercharge our reach and making an impact in the community in a positive way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. We've been looking at social mobility probably for about a decade at KPMG, but in the sort of ID space, only since about 2018 we started looking at it. But as you say, there's huge intersection, and we've certainly seen that in the data that we've collected. But we've been very open about our commitment to all of our colleague base, but more widely out to other businesses and bodies. I think just because of the sort of broader commitment we feel as a responsible business around sort of that sustainable and inclusive growth. And I think that sort of narrative has really helped when we first started out on our social mobility journey. We first stood up a governance group. So one of the things I was really keen for is we'd started to capture data, but we didn't have the kind of colleague stories, we didn't have the colleague view of those from a lower socioeconomic background. So we set up what's called a social mobility action and advocacy group. It doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue, but effectively representatives from across the organisation through like a story, a newsroom story that we put out to all of our colleagues. We asked for volunteers. And when we had a great number of colleagues come forward, and we chose a number that represented different grades of the organisation, different parts of our business. And that's been running now for 4 years. And they've been sort of our check and challenge around our strategy on socioeconomic diversity, giving the voice effectively. And as part of that, they ended up developing our social mobility network, which is now thriving with over 900 members. And that started locally in Scotland and then expanded out to a national network. And I think what that's really driven is a much more sort of inclusive culture in the first instance, but actually the sort of the role models, the voices. I see some of the chat that they have on Teams, and people are sort of doing a "this is me," and then they see other people and they volunteer. And it's really important, I think, to bring those stories to the fore, to make sure that people feel included, can see ahead of them that there is opportunity for progression. And we talked earlier, I think Layla was talking about sponsorship over mentoring. So we do have a mentoring program that's run through that network, but actually what we've experienced in other areas of ID is how important sponsorship is. To really kind of advocate, as we've been saying, for colleagues who might not be able to advocate for themselves, or things like work allocation, which are massive in terms of your progression opportunities. And our colleagues through listening groups from our social mobility network have said that they're not necessarily confident enough to advocate in that space. They might not have the social capital, as I know we've seen in the report, to put themselves forward. So it's so important to make sure those champions and those sponsors are existing. So it's being intentional and thinking about that. But the network's been amazing, and making sure that you're hearing from those that come from a low socioeconomic background is absolutely pivotal when setting your strategy.
Probably just build on that, and I think the real benefit of having the which obviously preaching to the converted, I'm sure, but it gives you a community of people within your business that you can use as a soundboard, whether that's a proper governance committee or just a group of passionate people coming together, and that allows you to have these open conversations and test and learn things in for you as an organisation, like quite a safe space as well, right? Sort of indirectly linked, but on that point of privilege, I think one of the things that's come out for us as part of that conversation is around the policies that you have in place. Obviously, we talk a lot about systemic changes and systemic causes of all of these topics that we're talking about. But one of the questions that came through was, like, me personally and some of our other people work with a company called Yes Future, a charity called Yes Futures. I don't know if nobody's heard of them, look them up. They always need volunteers, but they essentially, you go into the organisation as a volunteer coach and you work with kids in schools, and you very quickly learn that it's not, the coaching becomes secondary very quickly, and it's actually just about having positive role models and positive connections and giving people visibility of possibility, if that makes sense. But one of the things that came through from that is invariably the kids that come together through that are pupil premium kids, so they come from a lower socioeconomic background. And you look at even National Literacy Trust, I think will tell you that 1 in 6 British adults have got a reading age of 11. So straight away there's an accessibility question around, like, it's great having all these things in place, but if you can't even read your employment contract or understand what you're reading in your employment, so it starts to go to a real depth of things that you should think about, I think. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we had such a great panel on data. There's probably not loads I can build on that, actually. But for us, so we've been asking questions. Socioeconomic is probably one of the harder facets to track from a data perspective, right? Lots of nods. So it's more of an anecdotal data gathering exercise, I suppose. So we've been, for our intern program particularly, that's been running for a few years, we gather data at both candidate stage and for those candidates that are successful coming through, so we can start to look at where things might fall down. And we've just recently started collecting data for all candidates as well. So, and that part we don't have enough for it to sort of get anything robust out of that at the moment. But certainly for our intern program, we've got a lot of rich data there. And it tells you things that you probably aren't surprised surprised at. Colleagues living with disabilities, or those living with neurodivergence or identifying as neurodivergent, tend to be in unemployment for longer than their colleagues. We find the same for black and mixed race colleagues also experiencing longer periods of unemployment. So compared to all other ethnicities, actually. So again, probably not massively surprising. One thing that, again, coming back to that point around intersectionality, that sort of was a bit surprising and did start quite an interesting conversation was around white working class men, and not necessarily them finding a barrier, to your point, Jenny, about Hannah, about privilege, not necessarily finding a barrier to getting into work, because I think that privilege sort of played in their favour a little bit, but actually they really struggled more than any other demographic in our cohort of integrating culturally into the business. Like, I think that impact was really fundamentally misunderstood by our business, actually, and by their white colleagues as well, which was quite a big push. And the other thing, which I think is becoming less of an issue now, but something that really stood out for us, was coming out of the pandemic. We partnered with the government's Kickstart scheme. I don't know if anybody else tapped into that. And really, it was about partnering with local job centres to find candidates for primarily entry-level or internship opportunities. So it dovetailed very nicely with the program that we had already. And actually, what we found from gathering this data, which I think would have been a massive blind spot had we not been, but a lot of the candidates that were on universal credit coming through the job centre were actually graduates, actually had as much as 2 years experience in some cases. And whilst obviously that's alarming in terms of what it says about unemployment rates, and it's horrible if you're that individual that can't find work, the sort of impact of not being aware of that was that for people of low socioeconomic status, who our program was designed for primarily, it just creates an extra layer of competition and makes it harder again for them to access the opportunities, because there was danger of them being snapped up by people it wasn't designed for, I suppose.
We're relatively new on our self-ID journey when it comes to socio-economic inclusion. We're actually launching a socio-economic inclusion plan for this year, which will be really exciting and will include more ways to measure. I think one of the things that really stands out for us as an organisation is thinking once again intersectionally around what are some of the problems and challenges from a socio-economic lens that led to the challenges we have as an organisation. So we know that due to COVID and the unemployment crisis, off the back of that, young people are more affected by that. And in looking at our stats and representation, I talked about the fact that most of our frontline population is traditional working class, but we know that traditional working class populations typically are also in the older demographic when you look at those strands. So looking at that for our organisation, what we established was that where average tenure is about 17 years, we're not actually creating capacity for new entrants, young people to join our organisation, and less than 10% of our frontline is actually under the age of 30, which is a very stark kind of realisation for us. So it wasn't just about what that implies for our kind of talent challenges, but also the organisation of the future. Where's our talent going to come from? In the future. So a lot of our focus has been in that space. And once we started to delve into the challenges, why aren't we getting as many young people in the pipeline? There are a few trends that we started to notice. So the first is around access to things like driving. Being on postie means you have to drive, to deliver parcels. It sounds so simple, but there were lots of young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who couldn't afford to take that journey. So when we started our apprenticeship schemes, and that's a massive lever for us in driving better outcomes in this space, we're recruiting 500 apprentices this year. We also included driving as part of that, so we're able to provide that mechanism for them to learn with us and start their careers as early as 16, right? So for those who can't afford to go to university, it actually becomes a really credible career opportunity to learn how to drive. And we also recognise with the fact that the type of organisation we have, that a lot of our union engagement means there's a lot of our policies from a union lens, or the support that's provided, means that people who've been in the organisation for longer therefore receive more opportunities. So that was impacting equity. So we started to look at how we broker with the unions, right, around if we want to attract a workforce of the future, especially if we're looking at the socio-economic lens and the impact we could make externally in creating opportunities for young people, we need to think about that. So I think for me the biggest learn there that I would share is sometimes waiting for the data is probably not good enough. Like, we've recognised that there's stuff we can actually start to do, and having conversations and delving into root cause has given us an opportunity to start. And I think starting with that positive intent, talking about the plans we have, what we're trying to do, means that when we do start to collect that data, people feel confident telling us the data because they know we're going to use it for the right thing, and that it helps us to inform more meaningful outcomes.
I just wanted to add, I mean, I guess as an accountancy firm, it might not surprise you that we absolutely love data. But just a couple of things. I know they're referenced in the DDR. We have been capturing SEB data, I think, since 2016. We started using parental occupation back in 2016. So we've got a really good data set. And I know in the earlier panel, there was references to kind of the insights you can get from that. And it's been fascinating seeing in a big organisation which parts of the business have greater or less socioeconomic diversity. It's really quite stark depending on the different skills required. And also we've got this very interesting like hourglass shape. So we've got great socioeconomic diversity coming in through those early talent programmes, and then we've got a real challenge at middle management, and then at the very top at our partnership, they're the most socioeconomically diverse grade, which was quite fascinating, and it plays out in our socioeconomic pay gaps as well. But I just wanted to reference back at the end of last year, we published something called Mind the Gap, which was a progression report. We'd done something similar back in 2017 where we had analysed lots of data in partnership with the Bridge Group, looking at the time it takes to progress within the organisation, and we repeated it in 2022 and looked at the intersections of gender, ethnicity, SEB, disability and sexual orientation. And I think just the most stark finding was that socioeconomic diversity or socioeconomic background was the biggest barrier to career progression. It was taking our colleagues 19% longer if they were from a lower socioeconomic background. And then there was a hierarchy of progression. So you overlaid gender or you overlaid ethnicity, and that grew in terms of time. So our fastest kind of progressing colleagues was Asian, male, high socioeconomic background, and our slowest progressing was female and lower SEB, white colleagues. So I just think it was really interesting. And you said earlier about leaning into that discomfort. It was quite uncomfortable reading, and we had lots of focus groups and sort of listening sessions afterwards with our employee network for social mobility, talking about that, because it's pretty uncomfortable facing into the fact you do have a gap. We'd marginally improved it by 2 percentage points from 5 years prior, but the other progression gaps by gender ethnicity had vastly improved. So there's a lot of work to do. But I think just from that earlier panel where we were talking about the insights you can gather from that data and then overlaid with kind of what your colleagues are telling you, the barriers they're facing, has been hugely insightful. So yeah, all for the data.
So I've already shared one before, which is the importance of starting with what you have. And even when you start to measure socioeconomic inclusion, I think it's challenging, right? Especially in the UK with the question set you work with, that we know when in my previous organisation, when we started talking about self-ID for socioeconomic inclusion, the challenge was around how those questions in themselves would be interpreted, perceived, how they're translated in everyday life. Hannah talked about the intersection with privilege and how people's situations change, right? So how do you then start to actually quantify that in a set of questions? I think is difficult. So there's something about starting with what you have. What's your geographical reach, which is a big question for us. What does census data tell us about those geographies and the talent pool we're fishing from, right? Because straight away that's a data point that we're able to leverage and start to use. And speaking to their colleagues, what are the challenges? What's the problems? What can we do here and now to fix that? Because like I said, that then drives trust, it drives intent, so that when you do go out asking for more formal data, there's a lot more of a foundation that's built to be able to leverage that.
Yeah. I guess on top of data, I'd probably just say collaboration. So this is an amazing example, right, of so many organisations coming together, share that story. But the challenge in the UK on social mobility is so vast. There's just so much that we all need to do that I think collaboration is really important. So there are kind of sector bodies or kind of broader organisations coming together to kind of challenge and tackle together. So you mentioned Progress Together earlier, and there's something called Access County in my industry specifically as well, but there are other examples. So I think wherever we can learn, collaborate, I'm all for that.
Yeah, cool. And I think, well, my super obvious point, like I'm a complete data nerd, so all this data chat. In fact, take any of my team for a coffee and it'll turn into a therapy session in terms of how obsessed I am with it. But I think you've got a real danger of, which is a blind spot of mine, is that you can just get lost in it, right? And you can overlay this demographic on this demographic, and you can cut and you can splice, and then before you know it, you've spent 2 weeks looking at data and not actually done anything. So I think action, particularly when we're talking about the trust and people wanting to trust and see what you're doing with the collection of this data, like that's action, right? So even if you got to do something, even if you're iterating around the edges or you continue to strategize in the background, just get some stuff done, I think, as well.
Well, hello. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Layla. Really, really, really nice to be here. I have been working for the London Stock Exchange for just coming up to maybe not even 2 years yet, but a relatively new joiner in somebody who's been in the workplace for well over 30 years to date. Nothing gives me more pleasure than to say welcome to the London Stock Exchange. I don't know why. I think for those of you in the room, I think it could have only ever been beaten by saying, this is Pippa Dale reporting for ITN News at 10. But it's important that maybe I do a bit of full disclosure before I start speaking today. I'm a director here at the Exchange. I'm part of their primary capital markets team. And within primary capital markets, I work in DCM debt capital markets. Point of me sharing that with you is I am not a diversity expert in any which way, form, but having been in a workplace and predominantly, if not completely, in the financial services sector, I am the recipient of your work. I am the recipient of what you have been doing for many years, and I am somebody who can speak confidently in what good looks like, more importantly, what good feels like, and more importantly, even more importantly, maybe what good doesn't look like and feel like. So, as Layla's already said, part of the LGBT community, part of the female LGBT community, and financial services are well, you know as well as I do. So we know that there's more to be done, but we also know that we have come phenomenally, a long way. A few of you in the audience, really, you know me personally, you've known me for a long time. There's more than one or two faces that I recognise, and it's always nice to see you here. So they'll know me well enough to know that I'm also going to ask you to indulge me just for a couple of moments when I speak. It is the London Stock Exchange. It is a over 300-year-old brand. We stand next to our slightly older sibling, another older than 300-year-old brand. We obviously have gone through life in a very different forms. But what I definitely think brands like the London Stock Exchange, and like actually many companies that you all represent, is that we understand resilience. We are here, but it's important that we stay here. So resilience can only be addressed if we are also agile, and also if we are visionary, and how that looks is, and how that manifests itself. So I think what the point I'm trying to make here, by the way, I read this speech about 2 minutes ago, so I probably may, deviate. I think I'm going to sound like Ronnie Corbett. That's a very UK-centric joke. I apologise to our overseas fellows. But no, but actually with importance is agility, and understanding what that looks like in the workplace today is very, very key. Every one of us in this room has seen, that has all been, witness to witness to, press which is maybe not in their favour. May that be about an individual, may that be about a community, may that be about the organisations that we represent. A London Stock Exchange is probably facing one of those times of its career, as we speak, and that's something that we're really addressing, and we're proud to be addressing with a very foot-forward approach. But the point I'm trying to make in connection with resilience and agility and making sure we get our messages right, long companies need good cultures. Otherwise they won't stay good companies, and good companies fail. And I really feel very, very strongly, as a recipient of the diversity, inclusion industry, that you really are the key holders to that resilience. You are building companies, you are putting together companies that will be here in 150 years' time. And if you don't do it well, that is the companies that will fail, and those are the companies we want to build. I know very strongly the senior management here at London Stock Exchange and at the higher level of London Stock Exchange Group, they want to build a company that is going to be here in 300 years' time and is still very much part of the global economy. And I would imagine that we speak on behalf of every single one of your own companies. These brands are brands that have been here a long time, that none of these brands were started last week. Some of them are newer than others, but they are brands that the resilience that you build in the diversity community are the resilience of the companies that you build. Everyone knows, I'm telling you old school stuff. The biggest, the most important asset that any company that you represent is its people, and then right behind the biggest asset they have is their clients. So being able to reflect our clients and reflect our workplaces is every single piece of what you're doing today. So before coming up, I did actually have to reach out to our D&I teams and to really actually ask them what are we doing, which we think, I heard you talking today, what does success look like? I mean, in essence, and I think it's just, there's many, many strands. You all have access to many, many different levers. But data disclosure, I think everyone's been talking about it. I heard Yahoo talking about it. I know Dial Global, they hang their hat on it. And I think somebody from the financial services industry, that is what tells the story. That is, yes, people tell their stories. Yes, it's important to hear their voices. But I think what it is important is, I think the coming of age of the D&I sort of industry is understanding disclosure, understanding what that means, understanding what those numbers mean, and then being able to deliver the surrounding sort of culture to be able to make sure that those numbers start looking a little bit more balanced. So that again, just the message just really there is to say, please keep doing the work you're doing. I think every company needs good D&I culture, good D&I practices. And I think it really is an industry that is coming of age. I think it's been coming of age for a little while, but I think it really is now right in the heart of every company. And I think it's up to you to make sure it stays there, because I think as somebody who is the recipient of your work after 30 odd years, I really have seen the value. I have seen gender change. I have seen inclusion on the LGBT agenda. I do that from sitting here in London, and I know that that is not the same in globally. So I do know that it is a story that has to be continued, and we do have to keep our feet on the fast pedal. But, I just cannot emphasize that the work that you all do is really appreciated from somebody just as a personal individual, but also somebody as part of the management here at the London Stock Exchange. As Leila says, that I'm a very proudly out individual. And my coming out story, I went through a phase in my career of not really thinking. You'll find a lot of people from the LGBT community who are like, coming out story, that old chestnut. And because each one is individual, and each one, some journeys are good and some journeys are bad. But my journey is a corporate one. I am 100% a corporate individual. So I think it's worth really understanding, because I think it's a good, and forgive the pun, but it's a good dial to realise where we are on our D&I journeys. So why did I come out at work? I was working for one of the French investment banks. And they asked me, and again, you'll hear, I do love a bit of history, and this is a very marked piece of history, but now ancient history. 1997, the year that the UK were handing Hong Kong back to mainland China. Top of the year, 1996, I was invited to represent my company in Hong Kong. Who doesn't? That's the reason you work for a global company, is to have those opportunities. I absolutely didn't, heartbeat, not even, said yes, rushed home, told my partner, don't know why I hadn't thought it through, doesn't reflect well on me, but I was in my 20s, it's my only excuse. But my partner said, Fab, when are we going? And it was like, oh, yes, of course, we are going, aren't we? Yeah, we are going. And as much as I identify the way I identify now, I am not somebody from the LGBT community who's always having to come out. I walk into a room and I'm out. But back then, I didn't look quite so gay. But my partner did. My partner and I, when we stood together, we looked like a gay couple. And I thought, I don't know how to deal with this at all. It was like I was going to a part of the world where laws were changing. We were all very fearful as a community. I wanted to go. I mean, it's a very difficult balance to do. So I realized at 28 that I had to pick up myself, walk into HR, and I had to share my identity with an extremely young-looking HR advisor who, in true in the 90s, in true 90 words, didn't respond super well, wasn't comfortable with the conversation. She was very, very clear that SocGen were wanting to support me. They didn't know what that looked like. So we went on a short journey. I did relocate to Hong Kong. Julia did come with me. We did have an amazing time. It was a really, really fortuitous story, both personally and professionally. But the point is, we are still having to face those journeys. You cannot send LGBT staff to parts of the world, and it is on your head to navigate these stories, these journeys, and we do, people like myself, we need your help. Week 2 of being in London Stock Exchange, Julia, another very fabulous, iconic, may I say, I'm not sure, anyway, iconic out queer woman, had just come back from Saudi. She needed some of the team to go and do some follow-up conversations, and randomly, it was identified that it would be me and it would be my other gay boy in the team to go, and it was decided within a couple of weeks that wouldn't be appropriate. And she was right, or it was up to us. It was a grown-up conversation. So we have come a long way that we can have those conversations, but have we come far enough that those conversations still exist? And so I just think so those stories of coming out, it's interesting. Obviously I think you would probably be able to work in Hong Kong, but would you? That's the reality. You have to ask these questions. It's a very complex story. And then the last thing, I just really want another anecdote. which is a completely different anecdote, which is really just, again, to really emphasize the importance of the work that you're doing, both here at LSEG and all of these other companies that you represent. You will definitely see that I do love a bit of history. I mean, I'm sorry about that. But anyway, I'm just going to set the scene. You know, I'm leaving education, joining the workforce. I'm going out for dinner, don't be shocked and horrified, but, you know, with boys at that stage. You know, I'm sitting around a red and white checkered tablecloth, probably, you know, a candle stuffed in a Matthias Rosé wine bottle, thinking it was height of sophistication. Anybody under 30 won't have a sausage of a clue what I'm talking about. You know, maybe there was a breadstick and a cellophane wrapper, which, you know, I thought was free, I thought it was fabulous. But we've all been there. But the gentleman I was sitting next to, or the girls, my peers that I was sitting around those tables with, thinking I had reached the ultimate sophisticated lifestyle, going into the workplace, I didn't think, certainly the boys who are now leaders in our industries, heads of our governments, leading, you know, right across the globe, they are in positions of power. Did I think my peers would pay me less? Did I think my peers back then would maybe not offer a job to somebody like me? Did I think that they would even be, did I think 35 years later they would be colour conscious? I assumed they would be colour blind. And 2023, we all know, every single one of you in this room knows, that is not the case. So again, I always like to wrap up with a very final but very clear point of why I'm showing you that story is, we think the next generation is going to be better. We think the next generation is going to find it easier, but they are not. We know that, we can see that's happening in the States. We can see that happening in other parts of this global world of ours. So the point, again, is really, we need to make your industry data savvy. We need to make sure that we're clear with our messaging, our benchmarking, our targeting. We need to make sure that what we are delivering today works, because it's needed by people like myself. I want to see London Stock Exchange when I'm sitting on a cloud somewhere looking down in 500 years' time. So I just really wanted to say an enormous thank you to Dial Global and all her team. I really wanted to say an enormous thank you right from the bottom of my heart to everybody in this room for doing good work, and never think it is not appreciated, it's not valued. It really powerfully is, and it's definitely had a very personal impact on my own life and career. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Pippa. I think we can all agree that was not only an incredibly powerful personal story, but there was some incredible calls to action and some very heartfelt and vulnerable stories that are not always the easiest to share. And in talking about you create the safe space to allow everyone else to share their stories. And that's really what this is about. What does diversity mean to you? I hope that you've had a little think throughout the course of this afternoon about what diversity means to you and how you can make a difference, because truly, every one of you are making a difference, and the life that we have is all that we have, and so what we want to leave is a fantastic legacy. I'm not sure whether you meant to, but actually it was really profound, talking about sitting on a cloud in 500 years. Actually, how do we want to leave this place? We want to leave it in a better place than we found it. We want to use the data to drive change. We want to make great decisions because what we do matters. Talking of people that matter, I'd really like the Dial team to stand up if you're not already. Give a little wave. That includes Dame Martina Milburn, who's out the front, who is chair of our board, and also Margot Slattery. A huge thank you. I'm going to name everyone. Jodie's been running our AV team, Beverly. We've had a fantastic team, actually, from Yahoo, led brilliantly. Thank you so much. Give a little wave. Thank you to our Yahoo team. James, my EA, Preeti, Amisha, Clarissa, who's been leading the review. Pooja has been a great wing woman as well for Clarissa. Alessandro, you are fantastic. All of you are brilliant. And also, we couldn't have done it without our sponsors. We have lots of branding here, lots of branding inside the bags. We have many other reviews that are being printed that will be distributed across the board with all of these remarkable companies across LSEG and also the New York Stock Exchange, where we'll be ringing the closing bell very soon. So Yahoo, thank you so much. Havas, Expert HR, HH Global, Pfizer, Barclays, I saw Ray sneaking in, Alpha, LexisNexis Risk Solutions, Verizon, no, we have Sanjeev over here, KPMG, Royal Mail, Britvic. If we did not have the backing, the power and the money that you are putting behind this tremendous work, we wouldn't be here. So please do think about supporting us as we keep moving the dial, excuse the pun, in the right direction.